This is Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition, with another episode of our podcast. Visit traditiononline.org, sign up for our newsletters, give us a like on Facebook, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Keep updated with all the offerings in our Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought. Are you receiving our quarterly print journal delivered at home? Now is the time to subscribe or renew your subscription. As an incentive, if you do so right away, you'll receive our forthcoming issue, which marks the 120th birthday and 30th yahrzeit of Rabbi Soloveitchik, a special collection of new scholarship exploring the enduring relevance of the Rav's thought in our world. In the 1970s, moral philosophy turned its attention to an ancient topic, but coined a new name to organize our thinking about it. That field, now known as moral luck, constitutes a set of fascinating and important philosophical debates with serious implications for both ethics and jurisprudence in civil society and within our own religious tradition. Rabbi Dr. Michael J. Harris recently published Resultant Moral Luck and Jewish Tradition in Tradition's Winter 2022 issue, examining the many significant sources within rabbinic literature that can be brought to bear on this discussion. Rabbi Harris is Senior Rabbi of the Hampstead Synagogue in London and Senior Research Fellow at the London School of Jewish Studies. The conversation delved into his essay and the literature surrounding moral luck, but also discussed how he navigates his role as both community rabbi and academic scholar, and the general state of philosophical inquiry and the liberal arts within modern orthodoxy today. Welcome to the Tradition Podcast, Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris.
Thank you very much.
In the realm of philosophy, which is an area that you spend a lot of time, in addition to your responsibilities there in the Hampstead Synagogue, there are certain topics we, in our Jewish parlance, would call them sugyot, things like the happy slave or the trolley problem. And in the case of our conversation today, the topic of moral luck and the different varieties of moral luck that somehow fascinate those of us that spend a lot of time in the Beit Midrash. And we naturally gravitate towards these topics in philosophy and moral philosophy and try to figure out, okay, what's the Jewish angle? So before we get into today's specific topic of the really interesting essay that you wrote about moral luck or resultant moral luck, how does that take place in your mind as someone with one foot in the world of the academy and philosophy and one world in the synagogue and study hall? How does that kind of connection of trying to think about what's the Talmudic angle, the rabbinic angle, the Jewish angle on a particular topic in contemporary philosophy?
I think it comes up quite naturally just from trying to have a foot in both worlds. I think that part of it, I think, has to do with the method of reasoning. A friend of mine who is quite secular says that he was describing to very dati relatives what he did as a professional philosopher, and he described philosophy to them as Talmud without Torah. And it's a way of thinking that we try and reason through a sugya. The kinds of questions we ask, the analytic approach we take, has a great deal in common with the methodology of the analytic Western philosophical tradition. And therefore, I think for anyone who's involved with both, it's quite natural that one will be in one field or the other at any given moment and think, hang on a second, there's something very relevant here in the other field.
And for yourself, do those questions flow in both directions, from the Beit Midrash to the lecture hall and vice versa?
Yes, definitely. Definitely, sometimes they arise in one context and sometimes in the other. And actually, most of my published work has been at the interface as a result of questions like that arising in one context or the other.
Okay, so before we, pull down Masechet Bava Kama from the shelf and open up the Sifrei Kodesh, why don't you introduce us to this topic of moral luck, or the specific variety of resultant moral luck, which was kind of first advanced, even though these were ideas that existed. I mean, you point to precedents in our own tradition going back millennia, but until we give a topic a name, we don't really start to categorize it in the same way. So in the 1970s, there were a pair of articles by Nagel, by Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams, in conversation with each other on this topic of moral luck. So introduce to our listeners, what is this topic?
So the topic of moral luck, Jeff, is really a major philosophical problem, which got its name, as you point out, originally in the 1970s. That very influential pair of articles. There was actually an earlier writings by Joel Feinberg in 1970. But obviously very recently, the terminology is coined very recently in the history of philosophy. So the problem is that we have a very strong intuition that moral assessment of other people, or indeed moral assessment of ourselves, should be based only on factors which are within the control of the person acting. In other words, it's not fair for me to blame my friend for doing something wrong, for example, if his doing something wrong was to do with circumstances beyond his control. Nagel, Williams and Nagel both talk about several kinds of moral luck. I focus in the article in tradition on resultant moral luck, because I think that's where we have the richest makorot, but it's a wider concept. So to give one, before going into resultant moral luck, to give one other example moral luck of another kind, there is what Nagel calls constitutive moral luck. So we are born with certain inclinations, certain abilities, certain inner tendencies. Of course, there is a measure of control that we have over these, but to a large extent, they influence our behavior to a very great degree, and they are not under our control. In our genetic inheritance, for example, it's not something that we can choose. We're just born with it, and yet it affects our actions to a great degree. And so there is a problem. Striking example that I think Nagel gives is someone who we condemn rightly as a Nazi, who performed terrible actions during the Holocaust, perhaps would have led an utterly blameless life had they been born in Africa in the 19th century. Or had they been born,
wouldn't have been presented with the same moral challenges in which he fails at, born into Nazi society.
Exactly. And indeed, the formation of that society, the Nazi may have been born in Germany or Austria, wherever, exactly the same time that he was born. But the political, social circumstances might have been such that the Nazis never came to power, and he would never have had the opportunity to be faced with the moral trials which he failed. So that's one, and yet we will heartily condemn the person who actually became a Nazi and did terrible things, whereas there may be goodness knows how many other people kicking around in the world who would have done exactly the same had they.
But they go untested, and therefore they're lucky in the fact that they don't have to face that test and possibly fail.
Absolutely, they're lucky in their circumstances, circumstantial moral luck. So in the article in tradition, I focus on resultant moral luck,
which I think is the variety that's probably much more familiar to people, whether they have a name for it or not.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, I think resultant is very easy for us to get a grasp on, and as we'll discuss, appears in the Makorot fairly extensively. So resultant moral luck perhaps is best introduced with Thomas Nagel's example in his article. Imagine a truck driver who has not checked his brakes properly, and goes out in the truck, and tragically a child runs out in front of the truck and he kills the child. So if he is a person with a normal moral sentiments and normal psychological makeup, such a person the truck driver will blame himself intensely, will feel terrible about what's happened, and indeed will be blamed severely by others, and indeed by the criminal justice system in many societies, which won't hold him as guilty as it would had he deliberately gone out and done this, but will certainly punish him for his negligence. Contrast this, Nagel suggests, with a driver who is equally negligent. She fails to check her brakes. She goes out in her truck on the road, but nothing untoward happens. No child runs out in front, and she arrives at the truck depot safely. I can't believe I'm saying truck. I should be saying lorry.
Our American audience, we've translated all of your terminology.
But arrives at the depot safely. Then she will not blame herself, like she probably won't give her journey another thought. Other people won't blame her. She's not in any kind of trouble with the law, and yet the negligence is the same. And so much in our lives, Nagel says, is subject to that kind of phenomenon, where even if he points to a central conflict of intuitions here. If you were to ask someone in the abstract, should people be blamed for matters that are beyond their control, for which many philosophers use luck as the shorthand in the moral luck literature. If you were to ask someone, should people be blamed for what's beyond their control, they would answer no. But as soon as you focus on particular instances, then, like the truck drivers, we're liable to have a strong intuition going the other way, that the person who caused bad results is morally more blameworthy than the person who didn't.
The person who just got lucky and missed that child in the street by an inch.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's moral luck. It's a fairly easy enough idea to get your mind around. And often in moral philosophy, the problem is phrased in such a way that it's such an intuitively easy idea to grasp. I mentioned the famous case of the trolley problem, lifeboat ethics, etc. These are, in the abstract, they become parlor games of trying to, get our heads around certain ideas. But when we think about this as an actual case of moral judgment and, frankly, of jurisprudence, how long should each person go to jail, if at all? So the halakha has an opinion. There's nary a corner of human existence that the halakha doesn't have an opinion about. So when you consider this problem, and then you turn to the bookshelves behind us and you start examining the makorot, what do you find, and what did you find? What result did we offer our readers in our recent issue in Tradition?
What we found, Jeff, was a range of makorot dealing with situations from various areas of halakha, and indeed aggadic literature, non-legal literature as well. And we found an array of different kinds of relevant cases clustered around a distinction between intention and result or outcome. In cases where sometimes the intention is good and the result is bad, or vice versa, all kinds of combinations. So to make this more concrete with a real example, we have a Gemara which appears in Tractate Kiddushin and in Tractate Nazir, where Rabbi Akiva talks about the person who stretches out their hand in order to take a piece of non-kosher meat, but accidentally, as it were, and not in accordance with their intention, takes a piece of kosher meat. So, a scenario I think of here is one's at a reception, perhaps one's at an interfaith reception where the people who have organized it have kindly provided kosher food for the Jewish guests, and they've also provided non-kosher food for the non-Jewish guests, and the Jewish guest there thinks to himself, here is my opportunity to try a piece of non-kosher meat, which I've always wanted to, and hopefully no one will spot me. Stretches out his hand to take a piece of non-kosher meat. Someone is talking to him, slightly knocks his hand, which then goes accidentally, unwillingly, to the tray of kosher meat and takes the tray of kosher meat. So takes a piece of kosher meat. So as Rabbi Akiva puts it in the Talmud, intended to eat pig and ends up eating kosher lamb. So Rabbi Akiva says that that person requires divine forgiveness and atonement for even if he just ate kosher meat. In other words, solely for the bad intention. In fact, Rabbi Akiva makes what we call, be familiar to many listeners as a kal v'chomer, as an inference from major to minor, which is that Rabbi Akiva says, if someone who intended to eat non-kosher but ate kosher requires divine atonement, then how much the more so, kal v'chomer, someone who intended to eat non-kosher meat and successfully carried through their intention and ate non-kosher. That I think is very. Here we have a case of moral luck, avant la lettre. In other words, millennia before the term is invented in analytic philosophy. Sorry.
Yeah, before the term is coined, the concept existed.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, when one should say here that this is really, what one might say, this is religious luck rather than moral luck, strictly speaking, because we're in the ritual realm here.
This was an interesting in the work of editing through your paper. This was one of the interesting points of back and forth that you as author and I as editor had. In other words, is it purely ritual, or do we view that as also verging on or overlapping with areas of morality which are clearly different than the morality connected to, shall we say, dinei nezikin, laws of damages, of causing bodily injury or injury to property. But the halakhic expanse of morality doesn't map on identically with the field as defined in secular philosophy necessarily. Secular philosophy doesn't see it as immoral to eat one piece of meat over another piece of meat. Yeah. But in Judaism, it's quite different. And there was some finessing in the paper, which the readers can see of how we kind of dealt with that topic.
Yeah, that's right. However we resolve that fascinating issue, it's easy to see that the kind of underlying logic of moral luck is here in this case of Rabbi Akiva. Here one's intention was to do something wrong, religiously wrong, morally wrong, however we define it, and yet through factors beyond one's control, one ended up not doing anything wrong. So there we have Rabbi Akiva saying the intention is very important, but fascinatingly also, by making that kal v'chomer, by making that logical move, Rabbi Akiva is clearly saying, if the bad intention ends up being successful, then that is even worse than the bad intention which results in something which is religiously neutral, eating a piece of kosher lamb. So that's one area where the issue comes up. Perhaps to take a non-halakhic example, in the same page of the Talmud in Kiddushin, we have the most fascinating narrative concerning Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, who, and this is an episode in the Talmud which obviously is open to rich analysis from many different perspectives, but just looking at it from the moral luck point of view, Rabbi Barashi basically has seems to have taken on some kind of practice of abstinence from intimate relations with his wife, and eventually in the story, his wife dresses up as a prostitute, and Rabbi Barashi, not realizing that it's his wife, has relations with her, and then, despite his wife's reassuring him afterwards that the woman with whom he had relations was his wife, nevertheless, he judges himself extremely severely, and I think the implication of he judges himself really as severely as if he had slept with a woman other than his wife. So here we have a non-halakhic context, and here there seems to be a very powerful emphasis on the importance of intention, even if no harm results.
So that's an interesting question. Is when you take this this topic in philosophy here, moral luck, and then you look at our canon, you go to the Jewish bookshelf to try to find the precedents. So you know, the sea of halacha is vast, and there are halakhic materials, and there are aggadic materials, there are legal materials, and there are, shall we say, philosophical materials, our own philosophical traditions. Do you find that that the orientation to the question differs whether you look to this shelf, the rabbinic halakhic shelf, or that shelf, the ethical, moral, aggadic shelf?
On this particular issue of resultant moral luck,
Yeah.
yes, I think there is. I think there is a difference. Aaron Kirschenbaum, professor of law and very accomplished scholar, in an article in Ivrit many years ago on moral luck and how the halakha compares to secular legal systems, emphasizes that the halakha deals with the real world. Halakha has to focus on the world as it is, and therefore halakha is more oriented towards results than perhaps the aggadic material is. So in the aggadic example of Rabbi Barashi that we just discussed, Rabbi Barashi is taking intention extremely seriously. But when we are dealing with pure halakha, we often need to focus on the results more. So, whereas one might
examining, did this act constitute a sin or did it not constitute a sin?
Yes, did it should a sin? Absolutely, and in particular, did it constitute a sin which the human bet din would need to act on? It would come before human court of law. There, for example, in pure moral terms, we might say that attempted murder is as bad as murder. If I take a gun out and aim a gun towards someone and pull the trigger, and a bird happens to fly in the way at the crucial moment, takes the bullet, one might say that morally that is every bit as bad as murder. It's a clear case of moral luck. Whereas the halakha, like many systems of secular law, will place a great deal of emphasis on the result, and this is attempted murder, not murder. And there are interesting reasons for that. The moral luck literature talks about the epistemic angle. Often our knowledge that someone had a bad intention only exists because of something they did. Whereas, of course, from God's perspective, as it were, he sees the intentions.
He knows our intentions.
He knows the intentions. Yeah. So, but the halakha is it's human beings trying to put God's law into operation in the real world, and therefore we need to focus more on action. So that there is that difference between the, as it were, the halakhic and the non-halakhic bookshelves.
So one of the interesting things, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong or sharpen my understanding, you begin this examination, and it turns out, of course, that moral luck does exist as a halakhic legal hashkafic category within our tradition, but in some ways it's actually even more expansive than it is in general philosophy.
More expansive in what did you have in mind?
In the sense that it looks to fields beyond laws of damages. It looks also to the ritual realm. It looks also to the realm. There's an aspect in the article where you kind of flip the question. Of course, it's related to the larger sugya that many of our listeners must be familiar with about mitzvot tzrichot kavana, right? If we can also accidentally do a mitzvah, the Gemara imagines all types of, or we can accidentally, of course, do averot. The Gemara imagines all types of outlandish, possibly impossible acts in this world, which would simultaneously either fulfill mitzvot or perform averot. In the ritual realm, which is beyond the concern of the moral philosophers and moral luck. But it could be that there are areas in which the moral luck crowd, would let the person off the hook, where we, if not legally, but ethically, would judge rather harshly, as the case of B'chia Barashi that you mentioned.
Right. Yes. And actually, Jeff, what you mentioned about the contrast between the realms, as it were, of ritual and ethics brings to mind one example I deal with in the article, which is fascinating dispute between Rabbah and Rava in the Gemara, the Talmud in Menachot, regarding someone who does something wrong on the ritual, Ben Adam Lamakom, between man and God's side, and something great on the interpersonal level, namely someone who goes fishing on Shabbat, so the prohibition on Shabbat, casts his net into the water, and up comes the fish that he was intending to get, but also a child who, unbeknown to the fisherman,
he saved his life.
He saved his life, yeah. Or perhaps known to him in different iterations of the case that saves his life. So there, Rabbah and Rava are in dispute as to whether we follow the person's intentions or his actions, and therefore whether or not he's liable for breaking Shabbat. And absolutely, that is a case which, from our point of view of commitment to halakha, we'd look at very different from, for example, a secular ethicist who would obviously discount the fishing on Shabbat as an irrelevance.
An issue, yeah. Well, these are just a sampling of some of the very many examples that you lead the reader through, and I do commend the article to our listeners' attention. It's open access on traditiononline.org. But I want to push you in a different direction in the little bit of time that's left to us.
Sure.
Many years ago, there was a book that was published through Yeshiva University called "The Rabbinate as Calling and Vocation." It was a very interesting book, which one doesn't see too much anymore, but I think an updated version of it would be very useful. It was a collection of essays by rabbis, almost all congregational rabbis, mostly in North America, but elsewhere as well. And they each spoke about different aspects of the rabbinate. To be a rabbi, as you know very well, requires a constellation of skills and talents that very few people possess all of. And we do our best with the talents that we have. Some rabbis, make their mark as in the homiletic sphere. They're known as great speakers. Other rabbis are known as halakhic geniuses. They're known for their scholarship. Others for their piety. Others for their role in communal work or in fundraising or in education. You name it. There's no end to it. And the way that each rabbi, and particularly today when so few rabbis are occupied full-time in their synagogue and rabbis are busy doing other things, we understand a rabbi who also spends time teaching in the local day school. We understand how those two aspects of his career and life fit together. What does it mean today to be a rabbi of a prominent modern Orthodox synagogue in London, where you have served now for many years, and to also be engaged fully and deeply in the world of analytic philosophy. How do those things two fit together? How would you like your congregants to think of what you're doing, in your side gig, right? How do the two overlap, and how do they contribute to each other? Besides the fact that here you take two different topics and you put them together, and something really interesting comes out for the readers of tradition. But let's say larger spheres of your career. How do these two realms intersect?
It's a great question, Jeff. Thank you. And it's obviously one that's constantly on my mind. I read the book Rabbiness is Calling Vocation as a young smicha student, and
Yeah,
still have
that's
it
when I encountered it as well.
Right, I still have it on my shelf. It was a great book, a very, very helpful one. The way I think I can answer is with a concrete example growing out of this article. This article actually began life as a mini Shabbat Shuva drasha during COVID, when I think we just come back to our shul, and everyone was speaking for a much shorter time than usual. So normally treat myself to 45 minutes an hour Shabbat Shuva drasha, but this was 25 minutes. And I just had this germ of an idea about bringing these sugyot together regarding moral luck. And I'm very fortunate in having a community with many very intelligent congregants who are often particularly interested in law and in philosophy. And having given this shiur, which at the time never occurred to me could be an article, people asked questions, I began to look into it further, realized the range of makorot, and then the article resulted from it. So, and that I think is in miniature how having one foot in the common or rabbinate and one foot in the academic world can produce a really useful symbiosis. I find, often with things I publish, they've started off as something that I've tried to teach in shul, then I've gone away and worked on it more, often then come back and given a more expansive presentation in a communal setting. And of course, doing it in a communal setting, Jeff, as you know very well from your own educational activities, forces one to not to be too technical, to be clear, to be accessible, right. And to make things open to the non-specialist, and the non-specialist also will come at sugyot from angles which perhaps professional philosophers wouldn't, and therefore in terms of education, and therefore when I always say on good days, the academic and the communal are enhancing each other. There are, of course, bad days when they seem to me to be getting in each other's way. But most of the time, thank God, they seem to enhance each other. And I guess make me look at issues I think about on two levels. One, from the perspective of analytic philosophy, but also at the level of how am I going to teach this as Torah to intelligent balabatim, to intelligent non-philosophers, and I think it's a very good combination. And my heroes, going back to our youth, Jeff, my heroes, two of my heroes as a young smicha student were Zichronam Livracha, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburger, who had this combination. I mean, obviously,
my two very distinguished predecessors.
Yes, indeed. And obviously they had other strings to their bows, to their respective bows as well. But that's a combination which I think has become somewhat unfashionable. But I think it is
the rabbi as philosopher.
The rabbi as philosopher, or the rabbi as academic scholar. Also purely because of the way, obviously, in which academic scholarship brings new dimensions to Torah study, and vice versa. I always think of my key example is always Aviva Zornberg's work. Had she not immersed herself in English literature, psychology, and other disciplines, then we would never have had the wonderful books of commentary on Chumash that she's produced. And we miss so much by not bringing Torah study and academia into conversation with each other.
Well, you touched on an interesting phenomena, which I don't think we have data on, but I think anecdotally, which is just as good as data, of course, for our purposes. At least one anecdote is a half a piece of data. I think we know is true. The rabbi as academic, the rabbi as philosopher, the rabbi as public intellectual seems to be a shrinking role. Someone told me recently, again with no data, that in the younger set of American rabbis, people, let's say half a generation younger than you or I, there are more MDs or people with doctorates in psychology, or people working rabbis with degrees in as therapists, than there are rabbis with PhDs in the humanities, liberal arts broadly defined. There's the old idea of the Dr. Rabbiner, the Rabbi Doctor, is a shrinking area of our career. Why do you think that is? Why do you think why there are no Rabbi Dr. Norman Lambs or Rabbi Dr. Walter Wurzburgers? Okay, those were singular individuals, but why do you think the rabbi as academic, philosopher king, public intellectual is in the state it's in?
Yeah, actually, it's a fascinating question, Jeff. First of all, I just want to draw a distinction between the academic, as it were, and the public intellectual.
Correct. Yeah, one can be one without the other,
yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I think obviously an outstanding example of public intellectual, Rabbi Sachs, there's a conference in memory of in Bar Ilan
Coming up in Bar Ilan.
Looking forward very much to coming to Bezat Hashem. And that obviously presents its own set of challenges, which he handled obviously with global success. The academic, the academic scholar who's a rabbi may not be a public intellectual and may be working in a much more conventional way, trying to publish papers, etc., which are not getting huge numbers of readers. But I think that is intensely valuable. Why it's in eclipse to such an extent, I think, is to do with a lot of factors. One factor which I suspect, it's interesting that we know this is happening in North America as well. One factor within the England, I think, or the United Kingdom, is your good old Anglo-Saxon Philistinism, where the life of the intellect is always viewed with a degree of suspicion. And whenever you talk to a young person who's studying liberal arts at university, they'll tell you immediately of a Jewish parent or uncle or aunt who's saying, "And what are you going to do with your literature degree?" Yeah. And that's still very much part of the culture. What use is it to anyone? But obviously it's in North America as well. I think, look, I think we know that globally there's been a general dumbing down.
Whether it's a dumbing down or it's just a reorientation, higher education has reoriented itself around the more quote unquote practical disciplines for very obvious financial pressures.
But whether people got the patience for really sustained literary and philosophical studies in the way they used to.
It is. But there is a chicken and egg. In other words, people get oriented towards different areas of study, and the muscles that are required to do something contrary are weakened, or they don't have those orientations to begin with, so they're naturally gravitate towards the other things. A couple of years ago, I was visiting Princeton, and I was at the Center for Jewish Life, where very impressive, Years ago, when I was graduating high school, I was told you can't go to Princeton as a religious Jew. Kashrut, Shabbat, etc. It's just not possible. Shortly after I was at that point in my life, it began to change, and now it's remarkable. I was visiting with a nephew of mine who had studied in yeshiva here for a few years, and the amount of Torah study that was going on, and the kosher life, and the minyan, and the synagogue. It's really quite impressive. Considering that in our lifetime, there was a period where it was unimaginable for Jews to be walking around Princeton with a kippah on their head. So I asked, sitting around at breakfast, what's everybody studying? And almost everyone, to a person, math, engineering, computers, everything in the realm of STEM. I said, is no one studying the humanities? So somebody lowered their voice and pointed to a young woman on the other side of the room and said, she's studying whatever it was, Italian poetry, right? The early poems of Edith Wharton, Renaissance sonnet, whatever it was. But then hastened to add, but she'll never get, I thought they were going to say never get a job. The person said, she'll never get a shidduch. I think that attitude, although we laugh at it, it represents something troubling in the world.
So but I think also, Jeff, the part of the reason maybe that this model of rabbi as academic has become marginalized is this sheer range of demands, as you indicated earlier in the job, which of course have only become greater as time has gone on. I still remember when I came to my shul in 1995, there was no email, let alone
there were no cell phones. There were no.
Sure. And so the telephone used to go to ring more than it does now, but nevertheless the pace of life has only increased, pressures have only increased. And
well, then we're all the more grateful that you are standing on the barricade and producing the type of scholarship that you've shared with us in tradition now and in the past, and hopefully in the future, to bring these different traditions of intellectual thought into communication with each other, to try to explore how realms of general philosophy intersect with our own traditions and our own learning and our own Beit Midrash in ways that are mutually enlightening in both directions. The essay is Resultant, Moral Luck, and the Jewish Tradition, which appeared in the winter 2022 issue of Tradition, available open access at traditiononline.org. Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for everything you and Tradition are doing to provide a forum for fascinating debates within the Jewish community.